I'm Kathleen Sams with Red Heart Yarns, and we're going to be working on the simple spring swing cardigan. This is an easy cardigan. It's a very easy pattern to work with. If you just know how to do the knit stitch and the purl stitch, you'll be able to do this with very basic shaping to it. This sweater is great for office, any attire. We're going to start off with the garter stitch. Now, first of all, what you need to do is read your instructions thoroughly before you start. And I suggest that you do a gauge swatch so you can make sure that you've got the appropriate size needles. When you're making a garment, you have to make sure your gauge is going to be according to what the pattern's written, so it's going to fit you properly. So I suggest you cast on about 30 stitches and do a gauge swatch in your garter stitch, which would be knitting every row for about 4 to 6 inches, and then also do another gauge swatch with the same number of stitches in stockinette stitch, which is knit 1 row, purl 1 row. Measure both of those gauges to see if you need to adjust your needle size. We've got 2 needles that we're working with, which are on this particular pattern, we're using a size 6 and a size 8. Now, to start off with, on the back of it, we're going to work on the back right now, and you're going to start with your smaller needles, cast on the appropriate number of stitches based on the size, and you're going to work in garter stitch for 2 inches, and then you're going to end on a wrong side row. And then it says to change to your larger needles. Now, what that means is you're going to have your smaller needle, and then what you're going to do is your work will be on this smaller needle. You're just going to pick up your larger needle and just knit those stitches off. Make sure you put down the small needle and then pick up the other large needle. I think we've all done this a time or two. And make sure that you're working with both the same size needles. And then you continue on working in stockinette stitch. And you're going to decrease 1 stitch each side every 6 rows. And then it says 990, and you just follow the number of times that you need to decrease based on the size that you're making. Now, what that can be confusing when it says to decrease 1 stitch each side every 6 rows. Your first row you start is going to be a knit row. You're going to decrease a stitch on each side. Then you're going to knit 5 rows, and then you're going to decrease again. So just keep in mind, and I like to just use a pencil and paper and keep track of how many times I've done that. Always counting your stitches to make sure that you're going to come out with the right number. Then once you get to the measurements, you're going to work, when you get your decreases completed, you're going to work even until the piece measures whatever length that is required for the size. Then you're going to end on a wrong side row again. Just to show you real quick, this is the right side. So you can see here where we've got garter stitch, this is stockinette stitch, and then the top part is garter stitch again. So that is, the garter stitch is knitting every row, the stockinette stitch is knit 1 row, purl 1 row. And you can see on the back side, there is your stockinette stitch. All right, now, when the piece measures the appropriate length for the size that you need, you're going to put a little marker on each side for your armhole, and then the rest of the pattern is worked in garter stitch, again to the length that is required for the size. And then what we're going to do is, before you bind off on that bind off row, you're going to mark the center number of stitches required for your neck. Now, something else that I like to do and this is not necessary, I like to add 2 extra stitches when I'm working on garments on the base to use as a selvage stitch. And that actually helps you match your stitches when you're seaming together. So many times people have said that they have a difficult time trying to figure out the rows. So if you add a stitch for the beginning and the end of the row as a selvage stitch, you slip that stitch. On a knit row, you would slip the stitch knitwise. On a purl row, you would slip the first stitch purlwise. And here's what happens when you do that. You see, it almost looks like a chain. And it just makes it easier for you to match up your seams when you're sewing your pieces together. Now, when you're working in the garter stitch, that's not necessary. The way I figure out how to actually piece these together if you can see here, every 2 rows, it's very easy to just keep those, and you hook them together like that. Also, as you're coming across here, before you start your garter stitch, it says on the instructions, change to garter stitch, decreasing 9 stitches evenly spaced across the first row. So based on the number of stitches that you have cast on for your size, you're just going to have to divide out how many stitches that you're going to need to go between each one of your decreases. And that should get you started on the back of your cardigan.